Hey everybody, this is yours truly, John Selders, and welcome again to another offering of what we've called uh, relevant conversations with me, your host, John Selders. I appreciate very much you joining us tonight, and what we have endeavored to do over the course of these weeks, and now it's been a little over a year or so. We endeavor to bring to you conversations with folk who have expertise and knowledge from a wide variety of spaces and places. And and what it is that for me, is my joy and my passion, quite frankly, is to talk to folk who I think are smart and interesting individuals, and who are people I know for the most part. Many of the folk that come before us and we're in dialogue and conversation with are some fabulous folk from around the region, and in fact around the country and the world. And they are friends of mine, or people I know, and have and their lives have touched in one way or another, and we've interconnected. And here's another one of those individuals who I can say over the time we've known each other for a number of years now, and knew who he was for a number of years before I ever got to know him, and then we got to know one another and became fast friends and colleagues in the work. I got to know a little bit about what I believe is his heart for justice and justice making, and for doing what's right. And he and I were in a conversation recently. I said, "Man, would you join us on one of our podcast shows to talk a little bit about what I know is important to you, and should, quite frankly, be important to all of us, and especially in this current context." And we'll say more in just a minute. Let me bring to our platform tonight Brother Joe Elder, who we tease one another is we probably are related because our names are spelled too close together for us not to be related. Joe is an attorney at law here in the state of Connecticut, and I appreciate very much, Brother Joe. Greet the people, greet our people.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Bishop Selders. My name is Joseph Felder, and it's a pleasure to address your audience.
All righty, I appreciate very much.
Should I give any
Um,
personal information?
yeah. Talk a little bit about where you're from originally, and how you came to the law. Let's go down that road. How did you come to the law?
Well, I was born and raised in New Haven, in the what used to be called the Ashman Street Projects. It was post-war housing, which was built for the veterans or the soldiers when they came back from the war. It's an area in Connecticut which is historically, inch for inch, the most densely populated area, which included six high rise buildings, 8 to 10 floors, that had roughly about 2,000 families, um, including the area surrounding the buildings. They called it the Ashman Street, or the largest bulk of people lived during the time when I was growing up in New Haven. I went to school. Um, I went to a Catholic school, which was down the street from um, from the building that I lived in, and I went there through eighth grade. I was raised Roman Catholic, and in the ninth grade, I went to the seminary, and then after I graduated from Hill House High School, where I was the class president, and then I went to college in Ohio at Oberlin College, After Oberlin, I came back to New Haven and I worked for the local newspaper, New Haven Register, for 3 years. Then after that, I entered UConn Law School. I graduated from UConn Law School and I worked for the state of Connecticut for a year in the area of consumer protection. Then after that, I hung out my shingle, and I was a lawyer doing solo practice work for it's probably been about 35, close to 40 years by now, and that brings me to here.
All right. Wow. So you have an interesting journey. So you mean to tell me New Haven had high-rise projects back in the day? Brother Joe, you
Say
there?
again.
I said, you mean to tell me that New Haven had some projects back in the day? Um, what we would call projects today, um, that went up several floors.
It, it was a social experiment, and the average of the six buildings went up 8 floors, and then two buildings went up 10 floors, and it had 10 families across on each floor. So, and it was run by the New Haven Housing Authority. It was very tightly knit because everybody knew everybody else. There's nothing like that. There's nothing like that in Connecticut now, and I'm sure that there never will be again because over time it became I think urban planners over time began to realize that it was not the best use of space when you're talking about neighborhoods. I mean, if you go to New York City, you'll find many projects like that. But Connecticut is the kind of place which is considered to be um, above that. Connecticut's considered to be a more open space, richer space. In fact, there's a lot of people who don't know that there's a significant black population in Connecticut. They think of when they leave New York and go to Connecticut, they think of Fairfield County. And there are parts of Connecticut, I know I've been all over Connecticut, which some resemble Fairfield County, but there's many parts, many major areas which do not look like Fairfield County. They look more like New York. Where I grew up, there was a lot of people. Some did well. In fact, I spent 20 years as a member of the Board of Pardons, and I'll never forget the first time I sat as a member of the Board of Pardons. There's a gentleman who was trying to get a pardon who had been in jail for manslaughter, and if I get too long-winded, stop me. He went to jail for manslaughter. While in school, he got a college degree and a master's degree, and he was looking for a pardon. And he gave his presentation, excellent presentation. And as he turned to walk out, I looked at the back of his head, and I remembered from the time when I was a 6-year-old, the back of this guy's head. And it turned
Wow.
out that when I was 6 years old, there was a man who had committed manslaughter and went to jail. I called my mother and she verified it for me. So while sitting as a member of the Board of Pardons, I saw a number of people who I grew up with who had their troubles with the law and who were seeking redemption from their past. So that was one of the things that I had the pleasure of doing while I was sitting in Connecticut as a member of the Board of Pardons.
Wow, wow. This is great stuff, because what you have raised is a couple of points of history. First off, that the projects that were built, and we would call them projects. These are housing projects. The vast majority of them were built for right after the war you were speaking of, which is the Second World War. We're talking about the late 1940s into the 50s. And they were built largely for those soldiers who were returning back uh, uh, from war, to be housed in those places until such time in urban America, suburbs also started to be built out. And so we you got this what was called temporary housing, quite frankly, and what you named aptly, this social experiment of condensing people in small areas, in small communities, and that in fact is the story. Is the story, because we don't, people think that projects were built for Black people. They actually were not. Black and brown people, they actually were not. They were actually built for white folk, and these soldiers, because remember, we had segregated armed forces until 1948, when then President Truman desegregated the military. So this is fascinating stuff, and in Connecticut we have remnants of those projects today. Most of them now have been redeveloped under those local housing authorities. It's a fascinating story. In Chicago, for example, you have the infamous Cabrini Green, or the Robert Taylor homes in St. Louis. I grew up with the Pruitt Igoe project, which was the earliest one, and probably the most noted one for lots of reasons. But all over the country, here in Hartford, you had several of those projects. Charter Oaks, Rice Heights. Those were some of those what we would call housing collaborative. It's a fascinating story. You went on to Oberlin College, and Oberlin College has a fascinating connection to us here in Connecticut in particular. Just a note of history. One of those Mindy enslaved persons who were on the boat, the Amistad boat. There were three of them that were young people, and one of those young people came back to the United States for college and went to Oberlin and graduated. And so Oberlin has a long history in the struggle for educating people, which gets us to the conversation we were having that you raised last week when we talked. And you made a statement to me that made me pause for a moment. Your statement was something to the effect that the legal system here in Connecticut has been shaped and has been largely gone unchanged for nearly 200 years, let's say 150, 60 years. And that shaping comes from one man. You named that man to me, and I went like, what are you talking about? You said this state's legal landscape and legal history has largely been shaped by Andrew Judson. I instantly knew who the name that you mentioned. I knew who he was. I had some points of history, and we'll talk about that in just a second. But I was, you know how people say something to you, and you go like, "What? Wait a minute," and then you began to parse that out for me. Could you? So first off, let me let's situate who Andrew Judson was. Andrew Judson, probably known to many folk, was the person who sat on the United States District Court here in Connecticut, and he was the judge that ruled in the second of actually three court cases of the Amistad folk who we just aforementioned. All right. He was the person who ruled here at the old State House here in Hartford. And he was the judge that actually said that in fact, the Mindy, these enslaved or wanted to be enslaved individuals, these Africans were freed and were free to go back to Africa. Now, of course, there was an appeal, and then the case ultimately landed at the Supreme Court down in Washington, D.C. Ultimately, the Supreme Court in Washington, D.C. ruled in favor of the Mindy as well, and we know the rest of that story. So Andrew Judson, for many of us, we would lift up and say, man, he was one of the number of heroes in that story. So you named to me that Andrew Judson probably helped to shape the legal landscape here in Connecticut. Could you explain what you meant by that? And let's talk a little bit further.
I'm not a historian, but I am a student of the law in Connecticut. And I've done a little bit of research on the development of the law. Now, the law is never really still, it's always developing. Cases and decisions come out regularly, which shift the law in different directions. That's why, of course, Roe v. Wade, after 50 years, was changed, that area in terms of women's rights. Now, if you look at the Connecticut legal history, there's one man who probably had a greater effect on the law that we observe now than any other person, and that would be, in my opinion, Andrew Judson. Now, you've already appropriately pointed out that Andrew Judson was the district judge in the Amistad case, but he was also the judge in the case of State versus Prudence Crandall. I'm sure that a lot of your viewers know that that was the first case where out of Prudence Crandall, the so-called black laws developed. She was prosecuted. She was later acquitted by the legislature and made the state heroine. But at the time, her school was closed by different means because of the fact that the residents of the town did not want to have a black school, a school for colored girls, as they say, within the town borders. Now, what the black law says is that you can't open up a school without having the permission of the town elders. And they were not going to agree to that school. So she ended up being convicted. And the prosecutor in that case was Andrew Judson. Now, in that case,
hold on, Brother Joe. Hold on, just
in understanding his position.
But Joe, hold on just for a second before you go further, because I don't want people to miss this. Let's locate this time. This is 1833. Right? 1833, 1832. In fact, 1831, I believe Mrs. Crandall opened up her school. All right. She opened up a school in Canterbury, Connecticut. That's east of Eastern Connecticut. She opened up a school for girls. All right. And then not long after her opening, she then had one farmer who was an African American free farmer who wanted to who wanted his daughter to go to this school. And when the townspeople found out, they created such a ruckus, starting with taking their children out of that school, that began the journey, the story. That student's name was Sarah Harris. That started all the ruckus in that town. That town was the lived hometown to Andrew Judson. That was his town. In fact, he was the town clerk for many years in that town. So he was intimately acquainted with not only Miss Crandall, but her whole situation and case. Ultimately, what happened is Miss Crandall got convinced. She went to a conference and got convinced that not only should she keep her school open, she should make it open to educate Black young women. And she got the support of people like William Lloyd Garrison, down in Philadelphia, the Bishop Richard Allen, who is the founding bishop and the founder of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. There were folk in New York City who also thought this is a great idea. So she was able to raise money for tuition. In fact, I gotta find the receipts for this, but remember reading that even Catherine Beecher, who is the sister to Harriet Beecher Stowe of Uncle Tom's Cabin fame, her sister helped start a school, a seminary, a religious school for women about 10 years earlier. We're talking now 1822, 23. And she actually was very supportive of Miss Crandall. So this was a huge thing. Now I know we've lost much of this to time and now, but this whole idea of the education of women, and in particular Black women, that I don't miss that. Black women created such a ruckus that the town of Canterbury said, no, not on our watch. And they turned up. The kids say that's the terminology they use now. They turned up. And so it is that turn up that then created the stir that then caused for ultimately a trial. This woman was brought up on charges and arrested, and the history says that she spent a night or two in jail, which would have been unheard of for a white woman to spend some time in jail, right?
Yes.
Now I read a little history, and they said she didn't go there by herself. She had somebody with her, another woman that spent the time with her, but she spent time in jail because of it. And ultimately, the trial, which is what you named, the trial that then ensued, the prosecutor of that trial was Andrew Judson, who had by that time had become a member of the legal system here statewide in the state of Connecticut. Now, did I get that right? Yes. But Joe.
Absolutely.
All right.
Yes, absolutely, Bishop.
Yeah. This is a fascinating story, quite frankly, to me, of the subjugation of Black people and Black women for education.
What I find fascinating also is the fact that Yes. When I read the story, I I developed a greater appreciation for Quakers because the Quakers were strong in their religion and they were willing to withstand a lot of criticism. And I don't know where abolition would have been had it not been for the Quakers. But on Andrew Judson, he was the man who prosecuted Prudence Crandall. And in his closing argument, he talked about the short history of Connecticut. We're talking about a little over 100 years ago. And he could almost see back to the beginning of the state of Connecticut in terms of his his um his closing statement. And what he said, and I don't think he was being honest about this, what he said was that the purpose of the law was to prevent out of state Negroes from coming into Connecticut. He didn't touch the in state Negroes, but what he objected to was Negroes coming to Connecticut from other states seeking education. And the reason he gave was he said that Connecticut at that time did not have a significant population of minorities or blacks or Negroes. And he felt that the school would be a draw. And the last thing he wanted was to have any reason for black folks to come to Connecticut. That, by the way, was the same position he took when he heard about the effort to have a Negro college in Connecticut, in New Haven. So,
Let's
so
talk about,
many
let's
people
talk
are torn.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
let's talk about that a little bit, Brother Joe. So this same period of time before, let's talk about this a little bit. That same period of time before Prudence Crandall's legal case, that happened in 1833. In 1831, there was an effort to establish what you've named, we'll call it an HBCU, a college for black men in New Haven. Again, supported by leading abolitionists all over the country. Money had been raised. There was a proposal on the table, and Andrew Judson, who represented, he for some time was also the state rep in the state of Connecticut. He ultimately served in, now I found this fascinating as well. He also was a congressman representing the state of Connecticut. He was a congressman. Good Lord have mercy. Back in that day. He also opposed that school and worked very hard, as the history tells us, against that. And ultimately, the decision was made not to establish that college down in New Haven in the shadow of Yale for African American men. Now this was all prior to the establishing of what you named the Black Laws, which in effect said that blacks could not be educated, brought from outside this state to be educated. That's a fascinating twist on the law, because there were African Americans that were being educated here by other African Americans, and it appears by some white folk of here who were born here and who lived here. His opposition in the Black Laws that the state passed in 1833, I believe it was April, May of that year, the laws that passed, and we call them now the black codes, is that black people could not be educated who were coming from other states. And as you named, there seemed to be a preoccupation that, oh my God, Connecticut could be a place, a harbinger of black people who were getting educated, right? Now, I find that fascinating too, because another part of this history related to Andrew Judson is that he was an officer for the American Colonization Society. In fact, in some of my latest research, his name is showing up all over the place because he was a leader of the American Colonization Society. Now, you may ask, what was that? Well, the American Colonization Society was a group that said, listen, we want to get African Americans. We want to free as many of them as we can. We'll pay for them. We'll pay. Get them, free them, get them on a boat, and send them back to Africa. And in fact, it was the American Colonization Society that ultimately, there's stats all over the place, but some as low as 7,000-8,000, and some and as many as maybe 20,000 African Americans were repatriated back to Africa. And it is true and clear from the history of the country that was established by those same African Americans now repatriated back to Africa. And they then developed what we now call the country of Liberia in West Africa. Liberia comes from the establishing of Liberia, the country of Liberia comes from the repatriated African Americans. So African American, black folk here in America, we have a diaspora back to Africa. And in fact, it's a very interesting stories about how Africans left here and went to Canada, went to the Caribbeans, and went to South America and Central America. African Americans, that's a subject for a show of a different day, of just how many African Americans are throughout the diaspora. So they come from Africa, come to America, 1, 2, 3 generations, and then they leave here, and 1, 2, 3, 4 generations later, they repopulated other spaces and places across the world. Fascinating story. It is clear that Andrew Judson didn't want black people here. And in fact, I would say it like this: he was a white supremacist.
Well, you're so right, Bishop, because Connecticut was one of the original states, and it was a non-slavery state. But if you look at the southern states made reference to Connecticut as the best state of the original colonies, because Connecticut was the last state to get on board the effort to abolish slavery. And at some point, the southern states were saying that the northern states should all be like Connecticut. Now, Andrew Judson, he was the kind of guy who believed that Connecticut did not need to have blacks. He did not want them in Connecticut, and he did his best to make sure that blacks did not, if he had anything to do with, come to Connecticut. Now, you could come to Connecticut if you were a free man, but don't expect, if, let's say, for example, you were a carpenter or something like that, don't expect that industry would be open to you. The Connecticut Yankees did not go out of their way to provide business to blacks or put them in the stream of of commerce. So um, and it was Andrew Judson who came across with the original idea that Dred Scott decision is a Supreme Court case where the um, uh, Supreme Court is considered ever delivered, and it stands for the proposition that there is no right that a Negro or black man has a white man. That was the basis for the Dred Scott decision, and in fact, it stated that Negroes or blacks were not citizens under the definition in the Constitution. Well, that decision resulted in the 13th and 14th Amendment. But the intellectual support for Dred Scott came from Connecticut. And all you have to do is look at the decision, look at Dred Scott, and it mentions that the decision came from the Connecticut Justice was an individual by the name of David Daggett. David Daggett was Prudence Crandall's trial judge. He was also the Chief Justice of the Connecticut Supreme Court of Errors, and he was the one who communicated with Justice Roger Taney, and that led to the Dred Scott decision.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. So you took me down a rabbit hole. You asked me a question. You said, have you ever read? Mind, go ahead, brother. Go ahead.
I missed your question, Bishop.
I just said I was telling you to go ahead, but let me interject right here. That you led me down this rabbit hole. I had of course I'm from St. Louis. I'm from the place where Dred Scott actually was from. Dred and Harriet Scott, and that story is they left Missouri, which was a slave state. They entered into Illinois and went from Illinois up into Wisconsin and Minnesota, and then returned. When they returned back to the state of Missouri, they were re-enslaved. They had been gifted their freedom by their previous owner, and then they were re-enslaved. And so court proceedings then ensued. They were ultimately their freedom had been purchased and by friends of Harriet and Dred, and then they pursued a legal course of action, which ultimately landed in the Supreme Court. And Chief Justice Roger Taney, which is what you just named, was in communication with the Chief Justice of the state Supreme Court here. They had correspondence that I did find. I found some primary sources of their correspondence. And then you led me to, you said, have you ever read the actual decision? I'm not a lawyer, but I thought I had read it, but I did, I went back and read the actual decision. And there's not a little bit, there's a huge section of the Dred Scott decision that talks about this Connecticut case that was prosecuted by Andrew Judson. It's unbelievable. Can I say one more thing about this Judson character? So later, after the case, the trial between that was prosecuted against Miss Crandall. There was a minister
Yes, sir.
in a neighborhood, a neighboring town, that asked Andrew Judson about his
Yes,
position.
sir.
Let me read this to you. Let me read this to everybody. He said, Mr. May, he happened to be Samuel May. He was an abolitionist and a minister and in the congregational tradition. He said, Mr. May, we're not merely opposed to the establishment of that school in Canterbury. We meant there shall not be such a school set up anywhere in our state. Colored people never can rise from their menial condition in our country. They ought not to be permitted to rise here. They are an inferior race of beings and never can or ought to be recognized as the equals of the whites. Africa is the place for them. And I'm in favor of the colonization scheme. Let the N-words and their descendants be sent back to their fatherland and there improve themselves as much as they may and civilize and Christianize the natives there if they can. You are violating the Constitution of our republic, which settled forever the status of the black man in this land. They belong to Africa. Let them be sent back there or kept as they are here. The sooner you abolitionists abandon your project, the better for our country, for the N-words and yourselves. And I end quote. That was in a letter he wrote to the Reverend Samuel May sometime in the late 1830s. Unbelievable. All right. And I think about the man we see in the Spielberg movie, who we feel a little something for, because he's having a dark night of the soul, as he is portrayed in the movie. However, that's not who this man was. Andrew Judson was a white supremacist who did not want black people in the state and didn't want them in the country, and certainly didn't want them educated. Andrew Judson. So could you talk about a little bit, Brother Joe, then connect how you see this fashioning the legal, how Connecticut looks legally with this precedent vis-a-vis through these years now. Make that connection for us.
Well, the law is always evolving as it can tend to move slowly. Now, Connecticut does not have a long legal history of black folks, particularly in the legal profession. For example, the first black female lawyer, she was admitted to the bar around 1974.
Wow.
I knew Bessie Bennett, and she's no longer with us now, but there were not that many black lawyers in the 70s. And because of that fact, the law in Connecticut did not develop significantly when it came to black rights, because there were no advocates. There were very few judges. When I was admitted to the bar in 1985, I knew all the black lawyers that were practicing around Connecticut. There are lawyers who worked for insurance companies and corporations. I didn't know them, of course, but I'm talking about the ones that would go to courts from time to time. If you saw a black lawyer, this is around 1985, it was like, wow, there's a black lawyer. Who's that? Now there's more. Now there's more black judges, but now what we're waiting for is for the law to develop, because until very recently, the view that Andrew Judson propagated and espoused remained unchanged. It remained unchallenged. So, so even though Andrew Judson walked Connecticut streets over 100 years ago, there are remnants of the positions that he took that still exist. Now, I know if you go to Rockville, you can go to the prosecutor's office on the second floor in the Elm Street building, and inside the prosecutor's office on the walls, there are pictures of all the old prosecutors over the years. I have not been there in a while, but I would not be surprised if you walk in there and you see the picture. Symbolism of that is his lineage still persists. Even though times have changed, sometimes when it comes to the law changes slowly. Connecticut is one of those states where the law does not move quickly. It simply moves at its own pace. And even though trends have changed, society have changed, a lot of different groups' interests have arisen, it still has not fully percolated through the court. Now, I'm proud of the fact that there are a lot of judges of color, a lot of female judges on the bench, a lot more than when I first started. And I take pride in that fact, but I still believe that there's room for more balance in the judicial branch.
Well, I think you're making you're
I
making
spent a lot of time. I did a lot of work in that area to try and make the court more balanced, more amenable to the positions of people from the community that I came from. Not been easy, but I've done that. That's been my life's work, and I'm proud of the work or the achievements that I've made.
well, you're making a fascinating for me a fascinating connection. Can I'm gonna offer one more. You know, those of you who know me know I like history, and I can go deep into this rabbit holes a bit. But here's another fascinating connection. Roger Andrew Judson at one time served as a character witness for Prudence Crandall's brother, Reuben Crandall. All right. He had gotten himself in some trouble in Washington, D.C., and the prosecutor in that case was Francis Scott Key. Y'all know who Francis Scott Key is. Oh, say, can you see the person who wrote the poem that then goes along with an old English drinking song we call now our national, well, let me say it this way. The United States' national anthem. Francis Scott Key was a lawyer. His former law partner was Roger Taney, who ultimately became the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. Y'all see these connections? These folk knew each other, and there were connections far and wide across these cases I just find that fascinating that Francis Scott Key was a former law partner of Roger Taney. Roger Taney would have known Chief Justice of the Connecticut Supreme Court, and they would have been in conversation with. And let's be frank, he probably knew Andrew Judson because they would have been a part of. He was a United States congressman and later became a district court justice for a great deal of time. From really, he got on the court in 1835, and he served on the court till his demise, until he passed away in 1853. This is hooked up, man, and to see that what his opinions were and what his legal positions were influence, and what you're naming has yet influence in our Connecticut law and legal judiciary system to date. That's fascinating to me, man. And of course, don't we see it happening all over the place? When just the other day, there is a prosecutor of record who has just received some sanction by the body that governs our prosecutors. It happens to be an African American woman, and they're not, you named it, that for many years there haven't been many African Americans, let alone African American women, who are serving as lawyers and who are serving in our state now. Just called my attention to it, and just the other week, and there's a article in the in the Current that's for those of you who are watching us from across the country, and the Hartford Current is our local newspaper, and it's the oldest of the newspapers contiguously running, in one of the oldest in the country. And they offered up an article about one of the state's public defenders, who they're bringing up. They did a public reprimand of her, in large measure because she brings up race, from the way the article read. And I don't know the state public defenders and that whole regime. I do know some of those attorneys. I have known some of those attorneys who served at times, but I just find it interesting that even today, Black folk have troubles, and Black women in particular. This is a Black woman. 200 years ago almost, they didn't want Black women to get educated, and they ran the white woman out of town and out of the state. In fact, Prudence Crandall ultimately left Connecticut because she wanted to educate Black girls, Black young women. Here we have again, the question that we gotta ask is what does this actually mean, and what is the legacy of people like Andrew Judson, Roger Taney, who had relatives here in the state of Connecticut, and others whose legacy still exists. We run up against these folk all the time. What would you say? We got just a few more minutes, Brother Joe. What would you say we need to be aware of? Because this is what I purport. I purport is, once you know, you can't unknow. Once you hear and see, you can't unhear and unsee. So then that lays to bear for you and me and all of us who hear these subjects of history, to then grapple with what they mean and how we move forward today. Talk a little bit about that as we wrap up this initial conversation about what I'm going to call the legal landscape of a state like Connecticut. Did you hear me, Brother Joe?
the magnificent thing about the legal landscape is that it is changeable over time if given the right prompts and the right adjutants. It can um, be made to move in the right decision. There are many employees in the Connecticut judicial branch, and by and large, these are people who go to church every Sunday. They go home at night after work, believing that they've done good. They want to do good. They want to do good for the state of Connecticut and for the people of the state of Connecticut. They are good-hearted people. Um, that is, by and large, what you get when you come to Connecticut. But we do know that there are many who have differences of opinion. Some are conservative. There's a minority that are conservative. In my view, the judicial branch is more conservative than the populace, so that what the judicial branch decides is not always what would be the decision if it were by a popular vote. But again, I think that the people in the judicial branch are, at least we know that they try to do good. That's the good part about it. There's still work to be done. Connecticut is not it's not a progressive state, but at least it can be more in line with the view, the populist view of the people who inhabit this state. It's not going to always be an Andrew Judson state. I've seen change since I've started, significant change I'm proud of, a lot of change, and I think there's more to come.
I appreciate you, Brother Joe, because
and I want
what
to,
you
before we wrap up, I want to thank you.
For sure. It's because of you that I attended my first and only trial at the state Supreme Court. You were actually doing your thing and invited me. You said, "You ever been to the Supreme Court?" I said, "I know the building." And you said, "Well, come on through." And I'm arguing a case before the state Connecticut Supreme Court, and a case, in fact, that you won ultimately. But that there are all of these processes that I did not even, I wasn't even aware of that actually happen, and that affect lives. The laws and the cases and the precedents that are set. I'm telling you all, folks. I'm telling you, the Dred Scott decision had something to do with Prudence Crandall, and the case that was litigated some almost 20 years before. I can't even hardly believe it. You can't even make those connections. So just don't miss what we're talking about here. That the fact of business is that if we're talking about, this particular representative form of democracy, that's what we call this place, this representative republic, we call it a democracy. That and then when you hear language like we are a country of laws, well, some of them laws is real wrong and they can change. And in fact, the fact of business is we are part of what the change we got to see in the world. And so you made me remember that in a brand new way, Brother Joe. And I appreciate very much tonight that you took the time to come on our show and talk just a little bit. We have just begun to scratch the surface of this thing we call law. Any other closing word you want to say?
I want to thank you for allowing me to come on your show and address your audience. It's always a pleasure to be in your presence. And again, I want to thank you for the opportunity that you provided.
All right. I appreciate you, brother. And hey, folks, we'll be back again sometime real soon to talk about other fascinating and remarkable things in this venue, in this place, this platform we call Relevant Conversations. All right. Good night, y'all. Peace. And hang in there. Don't let them get you all the way down. Love is the way. We'll talk to you. Peace.